I was scrolling this morning and saw President Trump's post about an 80% tariff on China seeming right. And I just thought, hang on a second.
Yeah.
Didn't we hear, the complete opposite just recently? Especially with the big China trade talks this weekend?
Right. No, it definitely catches your eye.
So yeah, we decided to dig into the news reports on this one. It feels like a pretty significant pivot, maybe. We wanted to try and get our heads around it for you.
Absolutely. And I think for anyone trying to, make sense of this before the weekend talks actually happen, the key things are really the timing, why now? And what's the actual tariff situation right now?
Yeah.
And who are the key people, the negotiators who are going to be in that room?
Exactly.
So our mission here is just to lay out that essential context, kind of cut through some of the noise.
Okay, perfect. So let's nail down the timing first. This post went up Friday, May 9th, 2025. And everyone knows these trade talks, they're set for this weekend. In Switzerland, big deal.
Crucial timing, yeah. And to understand why 80% is even a number worth discussing, we have to remember where we are now. Currently, the U.S. tariffs on some Chinese goods, they go all the way up to, believe it or not, 145%.
Wow, 145.
Yeah, it's huge. And China, obviously, hasn't taken that lying down. They've got their own retaliatory duties, some as high as 125%.
Right, so it's already a tense situation. These aren't small numbers we're talking about.
Not all. We're deep into a trade conflict already. These tariffs have already, caused shifts in supply chains, raised costs for certain sectors in the U.S.
Sure.
So even talking about bringing it down to 80%, that could still have pretty big economic effects.
Okay, so when Trump puts out this 80% figure, my first reaction was, okay, is he backing down from 145? But then he adds that bit up to Scott B.
Yeah, that's the interesting part.
Referring to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, obviously, who's leading the U.S. team this weekend.
Right.
And that qualifier, up to Scott B, it makes you think, well, how fixed is that 80%?
Exactly. That phrase, up to Scott B, it's fascinating, isn't it? It strongly suggests that 80% might not be like a firm demand. It could be maybe a maximum that Secretary Bessent has the authority to agree to. Or maybe it's just an opening bid.
A negotiating position.
Yeah. It definitely adds a layer of, let's say, strategic ambiguity to what looks like a specific number at first. Gives Bessent some wiggle room, perhaps.
And speaking of Bessent, let's talk about who's actually going to be there.
Okay.
So we've got Treasury Secretary Bessent, as we said. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer is also on the U.S. side.
Right. Greer, too.
And then for China, it's Vice Premier He Leifeng. So these are the main players hashing this out directly.
Yes, principles, yeah. And what's really interesting, I think, is the lead up to this, the sort of diplomatic dance.
How so?
Well, for weeks, really, both Washington and Beijing have been doing this thing where they publicly try to look like they don't really need a deal that badly.
The classic negotiation tactic. Don't seem too eager.
Exactly, trying to build leverage. But then this statement from Trump about 80%, it kind of throws a different light on that whole posture, doesn't it?
It really does. Because, if you rewind just a few days earlier this week, Trump was saying things that sounded totally different. He literally said the U.S. was losing nothing by not trading with China.
I remember that.
And someone asked him directly, would you think about lowering that 145% before the talks even start? And he just said, no. Flat out.
Right, a hard line.
So going from that to floating 80%, what do you make of that? Why the shift right before the meeting?
It's a great question. And it really underlines how fluid these things can be. High-stakes talks often involve last-minute shifts. But, if we look closely at the timeline, there was maybe a little hint something was changing.
Oh, yeah.
On Thursday, so the day before the 80% post, Trump did say to reporters he expected a very good weekend.
Okay.
And he even hinted that, if the talks went well, tariffs might start coming down.
Okay, so maybe not completely out of the blue. The specific number was new, but the idea of reduction was maybe seeded.
Possibly, yeah. The tone seemed to be softening slightly even before the specific 80% figure dropped.
And then you had Peter Navarro, who's always got strong views on trade.
Often quite hawkish.
He was on Bloomberg, right. And he basically said, yeah, it's going to be an interesting weekend for markets.
But no specifics.
Right. He didn't really clarify what Trump's post meant for the actual talks, or if the U.S. was ready to lower tariffs without getting something big from China in return.
So still some ambiguity there, even from figures like Navarro. It suggests maybe the implications are still being worked out internally, too.
Could be.
And stepping back a bit, it's worth remembering Trump's, wider view on this. His post didn't just mention the 80%.
True.
He also added that China should open up its market to USA. And closed markets don't work anymore, in all caps.
Right, which connects back to his original rationale for the tariffs in the first place.
Exactly. It's about reciprocity, market access, addressing what he sees as, unfair practices by China. That's been his consistent theme.
So putting that 80% idea out there could be seen as maybe a tactic within that broader strategy. Like, we might lower ours if you open yours.
That's certainly one interpretation. It's saying, here's a potential path to de-escalation, but the ball is also in your court, China, regarding market access.
And we should probably manage expectations for this weekend, shouldn't we?
Definitely. I think that's crucial. Secretary Besson himself, when he was talking to Congress before this, he basically described these weekend talks as the very beginning. His words were the opposite of advanced.
The opposite of advanced. Okay, that's pretty clear.
Yeah, especially when compared to, say, other trade negotiations the U.S. might be involved in that are much further along.
So nobody should expect a comprehensive deal signed, sealed, delivered by Monday morning.
Highly unlikely. This 80% figure, even if it's a serious proposal, is probably just one piece in what's likely to be a much longer, more complicated puzzle.
Okay, so let's pull this together then. The main takeaway seems to be President Trump has suddenly floated this 80% tariff idea for China.
Yeah, a potential figure.
Which is notably lower than the current highs. And the timing, right before these key talks led by Secretary Besson in Switzerland, is really significant.
Can't ignore the timing.
It suggests maybe a shift in the U.S. approach, a possible opening for de-escalation after sticking to a pretty hard line on tariffs for a while.
That seems fair to say. It signals a potential new dynamic heading into these negotiations.
And for you listening, understanding this development is pretty key, right? This one statement kind of sets the scene for these talks, which are bound to be complex, and the outcome could really impact both economies, the U.S. and China, and, global trade generally.
Absolutely. The ripple effects could be significant.
And it leaves you wondering, though, let's say they did agree on something like an 80% tariff, or even lower. What does that actually mean?
Right. What's the practical effect?
Yeah, like how would that change the actual flow of goods back and forth? Would we see prices change much on store shelves?
Good question.
And you have to think, beyond just that tariff number, what else really matters here? Things like protecting intellectual property or real access for U.S. companies in China.
Enforcement mechanism.
Enforcement, exactly. How do you make sure any deal actually sticks? It feels like that 80% number, while eye-catching, might just be scratching the surface of what needs to be resolved for these talks to be truly successful,
Definitely. There's a whole lot more complexity under that headline figure. Makes for a very interesting weekend ahead.